In the meantime, we have an absolutely legendary man coming up next. George Schaller has spent more than 50 years conserving the earth. We met two people yesterday, 86 and in their late 60s, who have been putting their bodies on the line, protecting the future for those of us who will taste it. And George Schaller is someone like that, who has protected the earth for 50 years, protected its species, put his body on the line in different ways by walking thousands and thousands of kilometers to do censuses of animals that you and I don't think of in our dreams. And because he is there, the generations to come will still have something to savor. To speak to him is Tehelka's editor, Tarun Tejpal. Please welcome George Schaller and Tarun Tejpal.
It's a really distressing metaphor of our times that all our heroes of the contemporary world are really stars of cinema and stars of sports. We seem to prefer tinsel over tensile. Who we have with us today is really one of the true heroes of our times. George Schaller's work, anybody who has anything to do with wildlife has been touched by George Schaller's work. I mean, I myself was surprised when I discovered that this incredible enterprise, this incredible struggle to save the tiger that has gone on in India for 45 years has its origins in George's work in the 1960s. It was George Schaller's work in the 1960s that first alerted Indira Gandhi to what the kind of future, the desperate future of the tiger was. And it's post his work, which he did in India in the 1960s, which I actually happened to see just some months ago, extraordinary for the time it was done, that gave birth to a whole breed of tiger experts in India, for all of whom George is a guru, whether it's Ulas Karant or Valmik, everybody in that sense. But that's a very small portion of what George Schaller has done. George Schaller is the pioneering field biologist who first worked with the gorilla and actually pretty much identified the gorilla for the kind of animal it is. It's on his work that his proteges, Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, all worked later. I'm actually going to start by asking George to tell us a little about that first expedition in the 1950s, which he took to Central Africa to first study the gorilla, which till then was considered a brute of an animal. And it's his seminal work that then led to Jane Goodall's lifelong study of the gorilla. George, welcome. It's a real honor to have you here with us, and I'm delighted to introduce this audience to you and your work. Will you tell us a little bit about that first moment? You trained as a field biologist, we know that. We also know that for the last 40 years, you're like the Amitabh Bachchan, to use a crude metaphor here, which should sort of sit well with my audience. You're like the Amitabh Bachchan of conservation and field biology, 40 years there, considered the best field biologist in the world. In the 1950s, you opted to go to Central Africa. What led you there, and what was it that you discovered in that seminal expedition that you undertook?
I've always taken good opportunities when they were presented. Somebody asked me while I was a graduate student, do you want to go study gorillas in Africa? Of course you say yes. A lot of anthropologists said they can't be studied, they're too dangerous. Well, I know animals. With rare exceptions, if you're not armed, if you're gentle near them, they tolerate you or they move away. So I moved up in the mountains. There were the gorillas. Every day I went to certain groups, sat near them, and pretty soon, for example, one female came and sat on a branch with me, and we sat there together. A wonderful moment.
There's a great line that's often quoted, a line attributed to you, where you say that once you looked into a gorilla's eyes, it kind of fundamentally changes you forever. What is that moment of recognition that you spoke about?
Because gorillas are our close kin. There's not much separating us. You see a big, beautiful gorilla, you want to put your arm around it.
And when you do that, do you live to tell the tale?
No, I don't think it's a good idea to touch them because humans have a lot of diseases which you can transmit. But let me make a point. You had something describing me with studying saying lesser beings. I don't consider the other animals lesser beings. I
have to say that was debated much, and we felt that in the Think Secretariat, they did feel that you may be offended with that description.
No, I'm not sure whether you mean humans are lesser beings or the animals are lesser beings.
I know you've said that the human animal is evolution's greatest mistake.
Absolutely true. And where's intelligence? It's the only animal I know that's destroying its environment, it's destroying other species, and ultimately destroying itself. And you know you're doing it, and you're not doing anything about it.
You know, I mean, you actually written about it in a very refined and nuanced way, and we will discuss that in a bit. But just to finish with the gorilla story, so at what point did you exit the gorilla story and install a process? Because I know for a fact that one of the greatest conservation success stories in the world is the conservation success story of the gorilla. So what was the process by which that became a success?
Well, what terminated were gorillas, spelled G-U-E, because it was Congo independence. The Belgians left, it erupted, and it was too dangerous to continue work at that time. But with a lot of my studies, I've been very fortunate. Other people have taken it over and continued and continued. I go back occasionally to say hello to the gorillas, and after 50 years, Rwanda has done a fantastic job. They've got guides there. They know every gorilla individually, nearly 200 of them, and they have names for them. So if one is missing, they know and try to find out what happened. The money that's made is given
through tourism.
The tourist money are very strict. 1 hour you're allowed with the gorillas, you pay $500. A lot of the money goes to the communities, so they will protect the gorillas around. And that's something that should be emulated in India and other countries.
No, in fact, I would have come to that much later, but you know, we may as well address it now, because I would imagine that in India is the most pressing of our conservation issues. How do you manage the people-animal face-off? You know, you're a country of 1.2 billion people and growing. You also have arguably the greatest wildlife heritage in the world.
Absolutely.
And how do you somehow manage to preserve this wildlife heritage even as you square with this population and its needs?
Well, it's going to get harder and harder. In India, you have 41 births a minute. Now, that may not seem like much, but do your multiplication, that adds up to 59,000 people a day. That's a whole new city every day. How do you give...
new American city. It's only an Indian colony. 59,000 people.
So, the critical issue is to give people a reasonable future, but preserve the environment. Here, look, we've had all these wonderful talks yesterday and today. But what are they based on? Yes, war and so forth, they're all very important issues, but it's all based on the environment. Everything you want, need, and have is based on nature. You destroy nature, you have nothing. So right now, about 50% of the terrestrial productivity on Earth is used every year. So we're reaching the biological limits of the Earth. And then what? We don't even realize that everything we do, every act is an ecological act.
In fact, there was a wonderful presentation, the first presentation in the morning, that said currently the human animal is using about 100 times, consuming about 100 times what he needs, or he or she needs. And do you think it's just a consumption issue right now here that we are dealing with?
Well, it's both. Look, human population is going up. Consumption is going up an even steeper curve. The worst offender is the United States. They've been using about 25% of the Earth's resources with only 5% of the population. But now India, China, Brazil naturally want an equal lifestyle. Can we sustain it? I think this century, keeping the Earth alive, is our main issue. And
when you speak to policymakers, I know this audience should know that George Schaller's work spans 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and South America. And he has more than 20 game reserves around the world that have been initiatives actually of just his, stemming from just George's work. As you work across so many countries in the world, George, do you find a difference in response in terms of governments, you know, in South America, in Asia, in Africa? Is there a great difference in response from governments, or is it more or less the same?
Every government has good people. They're at different stage. Like when I started in India 50 years ago, there was no interest. Every forest officer wanted to shoot a tiger and emulate the Maharajas, and before that, the British. That changed, in part due to Indira Gandhi speaking out forcefully on behalf of animals. And she wasn't speaking on behalf of science. Science is very useful for conservation, but conservation is a moral issue. It comes from the heart. And people have to realize that.
So tell me a little, did you ever meet Indira Gandhi at that time?
No, I heard her speak, but I didn't meet her.
But, I mean, it's again something that the current generations in India don't realize and understand how seminal a figure she was in actually conserving wildlife in India, because all the wildlife laws were enacted in her time. As you just mentioned, so was Project Tiger,
right,
without which we probably would have lost the tiger 30 years ago. What's your hope for the tiger in India now?
There are about 3,500 tigers left in the wild in the world. Of these, half of them are in India. So India has a huge moral responsibility to not only protect one of the most beautiful animals of creation, but also its own iconic animal. And it is much more conscious of doing something now than it was, let's say, in the 1990s. So there are a lot of organizations, the government is concerned, but here you have the problem. Are you going to have the tigers in a series of little isolated reserves? They breed fast if they're protected. Then where do they go? They go to the nearest community and kill cattle, and are killed themselves. So
what's the answer to that, George?
You need core areas where tigers can breed in peace and quiet, and you need to have landscape planning. You need protection over the landscape. You have areas where communities have their lives, and you have corridors of forest and other habitats where they can move between areas. Unless you have that,
what's your report card on our attempts to protect the tiger? I know You are a guru for all of India's tiger experts. First of all, are our tiger experts good?
You have the best in the world.
Okay. What's your report card on where we stand on the tiger issue? What does it look like? Because the government makes a lot of pious noise about protecting the tiger. Funds are allocated. Public consciousness is raised periodically about the tiger, because, as you said, it's the magnificent animal at the top of the food chain. So there's a lot of excitement about it. A lot of film stars come and talk up the tiger, which is not so bad. But are we really going to be able to save it?
But it is not just an Indian issue. As you know, tigers are killed, and the bones and other parts are smuggled to China and other Asian parts. So unless there's better cooperation between the two countries, and the borders particularly, and a better guard force, you saw all the tigers and some of the reserves were wiped out.
That's right.
And they've been reintroduced. But the point is, you have the more dedicated guard force in a number of the reserves. Yes, you can save the tiger, but...
You mentioned China just now, and it's curious that you have a very interesting position on China. If I'm not wrong, you do believe that China has actually been outstanding in pursuing its conservation once it's been pointed out to them. And just for the audience, the giant panda was also close to extinction before George moved in 1918 to China and began to actively advocate with the Chinese government the need to protect the giant panda. And the giant panda today thrives, it's survived, and a lot of that has to do with the pioneering work George did with the Chinese government to save the giant panda.
But
I don't know, you must tell our audience about what your experience has been with Chinese authorities on issues of conservation.
Yeah. Look, I'm just a naturalist. I enjoy sitting out in the forest. I enjoy watching animals, writing their biographies. But you also learn that you can't just study something, you have to worry about its future. You have to protect it, and you have to protect its habitat. In other words, you do something beyond yourself. You help society in some way. And one reason I've continued for 30 years in China is because I found that the officials are listening. My function is to get some facts, make suggestions, and then say, here.
So apart from the giant panda, which is clearly one of the great global success stories like the gorilla, what are the other success stories you've had working in China in terms of conservation?
Well, I never consider any of this a success. There are no victories in conservation. If you treasure something, whether it's a tiger or a panda, you can never, ever turn your back. So one of my main functions is to work with local students, local biologists, so the next generation has the same dedication and continues the same work. And one reason I've worked for years on the Tibetan Plateau is because you've all heard of Shatouche.
Shatouche, yes, of course.
The
The rich in India wear it all the
The
time.
chiru, yeah, if you can afford it. But you don't realize during the 1990s, there was a mass slaughter of chiru on the Tibetan Plateau in China, and I calculate that about 300,000 were killed. And the wool got smuggled to Kashmir, Srinagar, where the weavers make it into these wonderfully fine Shatouche shawls, which became a fashion statement in Europe and America, and now still is in Saudi Arabia and other emirates there. And they declined. Now they're building back up because internationally and in China, there's better protection. But there's still a lot to be done. The wool still reaches Srinagar. The Shatouche shawls are still leaving India. And if you can afford them, a beautiful Shatouche shawl, embroidered, $15,000. So there's a lot of incentive. It's like the drug trade. If something is valuable enough, like ivory, people will kill it.
You said at one point, I remember reading somewhere that you said your early years of being a field biologist and discovering the world. In some senses, George has been like a 19th century Victorian explorer, you know, spanning the world. It's not allowed anymore, but that's what he managed to somehow do. At some point, you went from what you call the careless rhapsody of your early years into the serious business of conservation. At what point in your life did this switch take place from just loving the beauty of your vocation to understanding that it carried a great moral weight?
Well, you know, my early studies, I went to National Park, whether it's Kana Park here, and studied tigers. I sat in the Serengeti and studied lions and so forth. And I decided to say, I'm sitting in national parks. They're already protected. I've got to go to places where I can make an impact and help countries start something new. So then I started going, particularly in Asia. So I've worked in Iran, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, China, Mongolia. In each country I go and I talk to the government and say, hey, how can I help?
You go to these extremely conflict-ridden zones, many of them you've named, whether it's Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You go to these conflict-ridden zones, how do you get local governments and local energies to focus on preserving animals when they're pretty much at war with each other most of the time?
Now, as I mentioned, there are good officials everywhere. Iran is very concerned about its cheetahs. In fact, India wanted some of Iranian cheetahs to bring back to India.
And the Americans stopped us, did they?
No, no.
No, that was just, the Americans don't like the Iranians these days.
They have too few to ship out. But
is the cheetah going to survive in Iran?
There are maybe 100 of them, and the government is very concerned, and it is studying them, and I've seen a lot of photographs. We've given them a lot of camera traps, and they're got females with cubs and so forth. So these are just one species, but the real point is to save habitat and get the people involved. And that's the most difficult part, whether you're talking about a developing country or the United States, because people think of conservation as science. As I mentioned, it's a moral issue of beauty, aesthetics, religious values, and so forth.
In fact, I know you've said this, and I just want you to share it with the audience here, that you almost feel that more than science and good sense, it's actually spirituality that could help us preserve our wildlife. Will you explain that to us?
Well, I think two things are needed, and there's so many wonderful disciplines here, from poets to writers, photographers, businessmen, and so forth. Well, how do you get them to work together? The previous talk mentioned you have to combine
the big
initiative. All right. Who has failed? The media have failed. You seldom, in general, you seldom get solid discussions on environmental issues on television or in general magazines or newspapers. How do you get them together? Another one that has failed is religion. Here you have...
But you know, that's curious, George, because I think traditionally religions have always had reverence for wildlife. I mean, I know Hinduism does have a great deal of reverence for wildlife. So
reverence is different. You can have a lot of reverence and do nothing.
True. True. So why did you say then that, why did you feel then that spirituality could still be the answer in saving wildlife?
Because you have to, the environment is the one common ground you have. There's the oneness in humanity. And what draws people more together is the spirituality. Well, you need every priest, mullah, or whatever denomination to get up and know something about ecology and get its adherents to listen to it. The only world leader that has an impact and talks loudly and clearly about the environment is the Dalai Lama. But the fact is that, yes, the scriptures in Buddhism tell you should show love, compassion for all living beings. And that's wonderful. But there's very little action on the ground.
You have a very ambiguous relationship with this whole catchphrase of sustainable development. I know you've said famously that you got to treat natural treasures with the same sacrosanctness that you treat cultural treasures. And just because people don't have homes, you won't move them into the Taj Mahal and ask them to start living there. I know you said that somewhere. What is this relationship of sustainable development and the preservation?
Well, unless you have a healthy environment, you have no future. Or you have poverty. And
why is it so important to preserve a species? How far should we go to preserve the last 100 remaining exemplars of any species? Why is it so important?
Well,
first of all, isn't extinction a natural process?
Yes, if you're talking in terms of many, many years, but it's been estimated that extinction rates, thanks to us, are about 1,000 times greater than in history, unless comet
because
hits
of
the
human
ground.
intervention.
But look, conservation ultimately depends on the communities. All the laws in the world are not going to help unless the communities are behind it. So you have to work with communities to show how they can help themselves. One thing to remember, you put up a national park, you exclude people, that helps outsiders. It doesn't help the local community who suddenly cannot get access to resources. So how do you compensate them? That has to be done on an individual basis to see what suits that particular situation. Like if you have a watershed, by protecting the forest, clear water flows way out of that area and other people benefit. So what do? You can do what's called payment for ecosystem services. In some way, you pay the communities not to cut that forest. So it's complicated, but it's essential for
us to address it.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with hard, pragmatic ideas like culling, zoos, aggressively paid tourism? Are these, in your opinion, are these modes to helping wildlife and species survive?
Well, well-run zoos are useful because urban populations don't ever get out. They see animals on a television screen. That's virtual reality. There's no emotional connection between that. But if you go to a zoo and can cuddle an animal, that has an impact on a child. But they have to be treated well, and a lot of zoos are terrible.
Yeah, I believe the distress factor with animals in zoos is of a very high order, that most animals in zoos are in a very distressed state.
If they're born in zoos, that's all they know.
I don't know, many people here would have read the Peter Matthiessen classic, The Snow Leopard. You know, my generation grew up on reading that. It won actually 2 National Book Awards. It's unique in the history of writing to have won 2 National Book Awards in America. The Snow Leopard of Peter Mathiessen's has a figure called GS, who is his partner in the journey of the snow leopard, where the two of them visit the high plateaus of Tibet in pursuit of the snow leopard. Well, the GS of Snow Leopard, which came out in 1978, is George Schaller.
It's a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book. It's a classic. Peter Matthiessen is a little perplexed by you, isn't he?
So is my wife.
He says something 40 years ago, which would be true even today. He calls you lean and intent, and I suppose you're still lean and intent. But he also says that GS is single-minded, not easy to know. What is it about you that's not easy to know, GS?
I'm very focused. That's why I get along in most countries, because in political sensitive countries, I'm focusing on the animals and how to help the animals and the habitat.
And not worrying about the rest of the stuff that's happening. Democracy, human rights, that's all for somebody else to take care of.
Somebody else, and you've got good people here doing it.
You're onto a really monstrous project, I know, right now. You're trying to create a peace park which spans 4 conflict-ridden countries in Asia: Tajikistan, China, Iran, and Pakistan. Is that right? What is this peace park about? It's going to be 400,000 square kilometers?
No, that's another area in China I'm working on. That one is only about 50, 60,000.
So what is this peace park, and what's its utility and necessity?
You have this beautiful mountain area in the Pamirs that spans 4 countries. Animals walk back and forth across, and so there needs to be cooperation between the countries. And you have snow leopards and these big, beautiful Marco Polo sheep and others. And you have the habitat of the Kyrgyz nomads. They need good grassland for their livestock. So it's a combination of livelihood and wildlife protection.
And what's the response been of the 4 governments? Has it been easy to deal with them?
They're interesting governments. You have Afghanistan, which in remote areas doesn't really have, the government has no particular impact. You deal with local warlords. And Tajikistan has a lot of interesting problems, and they're the most difficult to deal with. China and Pakistan, they're already getting along across the border.
We make sure they get along. We give them good reason to get along. You know, there is so much that one can talk to George about. I haven't even touched upon the fact that George himself won the National Book Award for his study of the lions of Serengeti in 1979. Is that right? Around then, okay.
Yeah, around then.
Around then. His work on jaguars in Brazil is seminal, and most of the jaguar preservation work that's going on is based on George's work. George has also actually been instrumental in discovering 2 species in the last 15 years, which is, as you know, not an easy thing to do anymore. His work, as I said, touches anybody who's interested in wildlife or conservation today around the world. It's been a great honor. Please give him a standing ovation, all of us. Great. Thank you, George. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Great pleasure.